I spent nearly a decade underground. The work was hard and dangerous, but could be rewarding and very well compensated. Coal mining is a way of life here. Entire families have worked the mines. I myself have several family members who have retired or work down there still. I got out, not because of these experiences, but because I believe coal mining will end soon. There are other reasons, but I don't want to identify myself. Now, I'm no superstitious backwoods hillbilly who attributed every little thing as paranormal. I have a science and engineering background. Most things have reasonable explanations for the things we see. These stories of mine, or those that were told to me, are not the case. They have no explanation. The first time I heard of anything going bump in the dark was relayed by a co-worker. I was still a red hat at the time. For those who don't know, for the first 6 months to a year, depending on state law, a new miner must wear a red hard hat. They cannot leave sight or sound of the black hat they are assigned to. I was working with a guy about my age, who was a no-nonsense guy when it came to work. He was an extremely competent coal miner. We were working with a bolting machine when I looked over at the rib, the wall, and clearly written on the rib supports was the word ghost, followed by the time and date, which was a few weeks prior. Curious, I asked about the writing. He gave me a sheepish look and relayed this story to me. I was working down here off by myself, running the bolter. It was nearing the end of the shift, and I was keeping an eye for the relief crew to arrive on section. I just happened to look across the bolter and see a man standing there, looking at me. I was just about to say something when I realized that this guy was certainly not on our crew. Then I realized his cap light was emitting no light, and was in fact an old carbide lamp, not our battery-powered ones. My adrenaline spiked, and all I wanted to do was run away, but I was rooted to the spot. Looking at him, looking at me, he was about 5 feet away, standing behind the bolting machine, so just visible from the chest area up. Just as I was about to open my mouth to speak, or scream, I'm not sure, he turned 90 degrees and began walking along the side of the bolter. What's even strange is with every step he took, he would sink lower and lower into the ground until his head was below the edge of the bolting machine. Picture the stairway gag if you know what I mean. I snapped out of it and ran around the other side of the machine to see no one there. He was gone, seemingly sank into the earth with each step. It was just our crew. I wrote the time and date on the support to help recall where and when I saw this. I returned to the spot that many times, hoping to see him again. I never did. I've seen these figures many times in several different mines. They're creepy as hell, and I dislike them immensely. My first encounter was just after I had gotten my black hat, allowing me free access to the entire mine. I was still wet behind the ears, however, and given a job that was essentially a babysitting gig. Go me. The job entailed watching over a machine called a booster drive. It was a machine that was placed along the belt that transported the coal out of the mine on a long wall section. Its whole job was to keep the belt moving and the river of coal moving out of the mine to the process facility. It's usually a cake gig if the beltman did their job correctly. I shovel up any spilled coal and call in the cavalry if shit goes sideways. Now, unlike 95% of the rest of the time, the booster drives had lighting installed. The light would spill up the entryway only so far, however. Beyond that point, it was the same inky black nothingness I've described before. I'd been there for a few days already and kept catching movement out of the corners of my eye. I grew up shooting and hunting, so unnatural movement catches my attention pretty rapidly. It would always disappear when I tried to look directly at it. Thing is, I would feel frightened, and definitely threatened when I would catch fleeting glances of it. It felt ominous. One day, after a pretty active day of jerking my head at the blackness and seeing movement, always retreating into the dark, I got angry and foolish. I called out, "I see you!" Whatever it was took 2 full strides into the light. It was shaped like a man, same size, height, and shape, only it was completely black, a complete absence of light, but it had dimension, a thickness, full and thick like a person. I was so scared I got tunnel vision, and it seemed like all of the machinery went silent. I know it didn't, because the belts were still chugging away. It stood there for about 5 full seconds, did an about face, and walked away into the dark. I stood staring at the spots for a good 20 seconds afterward, until my vision cleared and the steady roar of the booster filled my ears again. My head stayed on a swivel the rest of the shift. When I was relieved, I asked the man who took my place on the next shift, you ever see anything moving down there?" He took a long look at me and replied, "Yes." I asked, "What the hell is it?" He said, "I'm not sure I want to know. I wish I could say I never saw it again." That thing scared the shit out of me. This story concerns another encounter with this awful thing. I was working the same supposed cakewalk gig at the same booster location. This thing was discussed between the man and I relieved, myself, and the man who relieved me. We were all generally terrified of it. Some days we would notice it hanging around just out of the light, making 10-hour shifts seem like an eternity of looking over our shoulders. Other days, it would be completely absent. The days it was absent weren't exactly the best either. It was almost as bad wondering where that fucking thing was than actually seeing it out there pacing, flitting about, or worse, just watching us in our peripheral vision in the bare edge of the light. The shift I was on started like any other. I attempted to mentally prep myself for another day of shoveling spilled coal while having the shit scared out of me for the next 10 hours or so. After riding the man trip into the booster, I spoke to the stressed out, scared man I was relieving. I told him about the weather topside as we were expecting snow by the time we got outside. He told me it had been a quiet day and he hadn't seen any glimpses of our shadowy visitor. We bullshit for a bit while he waited for the man trip that would be his ride out of the mine. Eventually, it arrived, and he wished me luck while I told him to have a safe drive home. I was watching the belts cruise along, transporting all that black rock out of the mine, when suddenly, all of the power kicked off. My work area was instantly plunged into the pitch blackness, and the dull roar of the machinery coasted to a stop. The sudden change from bright light and noise to quiet blackness was unnerving. I turned on my cap light and made my way to the power center that controls the juice to check if the power kicked locally or if it was more widespread across the mine. I found all my breakers still set, meaning the outage was more than my booster. I got on my radio and confirmed the situation with the power was mine-wide. I made a seat with some bags of rock dust and leaned against the airlock wall to settle in for a bit. It was at this point I heard it. Footsteps. There were footsteps walking toward me, but no one was there. I was hoping upon hope I would not see that black human-shaped mass out there in the dark. They were heavy footfalls, like the sound of a huge man in work boots. This was bad enough hearing something walking around near me in the dark that I couldn't see. But sometimes the footsteps would increase from a slow walk to a run to a sprint, to footsteps so rapid no human could possibly make them. I felt like I was losing my sanity. I can't possibly describe how incredibly frightened I was. Suddenly, the lights and power kicked on without warning. It was standing 10 feet away from me. I screamed at it to leave me alone, and it turned around and walked away into the darkness. I damn near passed out from the shock and fear of it. If I hadn't been sitting on those dust bags, and convinced my knees would have buckled from under me. Once I had calmed down some, I realised I'd actually pissed myself a little. Embarrassing to admit, I know. If I hadn't urinated so recently, I have no doubt I would have soaked my trousers. I fucking hate that thing. I'm sorry to report that a 21-year-old miner was killed on a belt line on the 23rd of December at my former mine. If you could pray for his family, or at least send some positive vibes towards his family, it would be appreciated. This incident was quite different from my encounter with the shadowy visitor. This encounter was also unique because I had a co-worker directly beside me who also confirmed everything I saw. My co-worker I'll refer to as Luke from here out. Luke was an extremely intelligent former military man with a razor-sharp wit. Guy was downright hilarious, and I always enjoyed working with him. Like many other guys I've had the privilege of working with, Luke was hardworking, honest, and he took his commitment to work and family seriously. We were doing something called a power move in an active coal mining section. To the non-mining folk out there, I'll try to elaborate. Imagine that you're vacuuming your carpet. It's a large room, and your power cable can't reach all the way to the other side of the room, so you grab an extension cord to finish the carpet. When coal mining, almost all of the equipment is ran on high voltage. The machines have a heavy cable that powers it and connects to a large metal box called a load center or power center. A giant cable runs into the section, called a high line, to the load center, and then all of the machines are plugged into the load center with a giant power strip. It supplies over 12,000 volts to the section, and I don't even remember how many amps. Enough to blow softball-sized holes out of the unlucky soul who makes a giant mistake and touches something they shouldn't. After removing all of the coal that the machines can reach with the supplied cable, we add a length of cable to the high line, move the load center further into the section, and then the machines can now reach fresh coal to mine. During a power move, more beltline is added to allow transport of the mined coal, and walls have to be built to control the ventilation within the mining section. Then the cycle repeats. This occurs in what is called a gate section, while longwall section is a different cycle. I didn't intend for this to be a lesson in coal mining, but I digress. Luke and I were tapped to the building walls to control ventilation. It's a crappy way to spend the shift, but ventilation is crucial in a coal mine. We had the block in place, and now we were required to apply the sealant that is called mud. It's a dry powder that comes in bags that must be mixed with water to make a brown, thick liquid that can be spread over the surface of the block and fill in any gaps in the wall to make as close to an airtight seal as possible. It's messy, stinky, fibrous stuff that's dangerous to breathe, causes chemical burns to bare skin, ruins clothes, and has to be shoved and spread into every nook and cranny in a block wall that's fitted into uneven floor, walls, and roof. The block was somewhere around 45 pounds a pop, and you had to use quite a bit of it. Area was 16 feet wide and about 10 feet high. It was a pain in the ass. Gosh, sorry for the long lead-in. Luke and I had humped all of the block in place from the pallets, and it was mud time. Problem was that the beltman had our water supply cut off to extend the water lines. Our boss told us that we were not permitted to leave the mine until the wall was finished. Without proper ventilation, coal couldn't be mined. Coal pays our wage. Coal pays the bills. Problem is, no water, no mud, no wall. The beltman wouldn't have the water ready until the relief shift had arrived. Different bosses, different orders. During the shift, I had noticed large pools of water had collected in the return entry. I told Luke that I knew where usable water was, and we could grab some buckets and collect water there to mix the mud. We needed water, but didn't have to be clean water. We were kneeling down collecting water from a large puddle. when I saw a miner walking towards us. It was later in the shift, so I assumed it was the fire boss on his inspection. Luke saw him as well. I noticed his cap light was unusually dim. It happens. Most miners carry a backup cap light for this contingency, since batteries wear out over the lifetime. I distinctly remember his reflective clothing we were all required to wear. He was walking towards us as we were looking down, filling our buckets with water. When I looked back up, he was completely gone, vanished into thin air. I half yelled to Luke, "Where the fuck did he go?" I recall him looking all around us, realizing that there was literally nowhere for him to escape to. Then looking back at me, he opened and closed his mouth a few times as if to offer an explanation and realized there wasn't any. Gone. We finished the war somewhat later that shift, and this experience became a talking point between us. After discussing several things we had seen, it became apparent to me that he had experienced the shadow entity I had, only not as closely. And I had met another person who I could confide in what I was seeing without being ridiculed. Some men worked entire underground careers without experiencing anything unexplainable. Others, like myself, Luke, and others, saw things that shook men to the core. I ran into a former co-worker at a local store today, and it jogged my memory of an encounter a co-worker had in the mine. I'll refer to my co-worker as Jake from here out. I spoke with Jake about his encounter a day or two after it had happened, and he was definitely spooked by what he had seen. It was very unlike Jake to be flustered by anything really, as the man is built like a tank. You all know the type. Athletic, weightlifter, good with the ladies, and irritatingly good at anything they attempt. In a coal mine, inspections take place several times a day in operating sections, as well as areas that have been dormant for a long time. These guys are known as a fire boss. Firebossing is serious business, as the lives of many men rest on them doing their job correctly. Mostly, they are checking for roof falls, rib rolls, hot rollers on the belt line, correct and adequate airflow, and the scourge of all coal miners, methane. It was during a fireboss run that Jake had this encounter. I was on my run signing the date boards and had to pass through a regulator, an airlock. I opened the first door of the dog box, got in and closed the door. As soon as I closed the door, I heard the latch of the other door behind me get thrown really hard. I felt the air pressure change as the other door was opened. I turned around surprised since I wasn't expecting anywhere else way up here. And it was looking at me. I asked what was looking at you. I don't know what it was. It was completely hairless, like no hair, eyebrows, or facial hair. It was a white or greyish colour, and I didn't see any colour in its eyes. It had this awful look on its face, like it was going to rip me up and enjoy itself doing it. I threw the other door open against the air pressure and ran. I'll tell you, just as I already told Donnie, our mine foreman, that I ain't ever going back up there. They can fire me first. I felt bad for Jake. He got in some trouble because he flat refused to finish the fireboss run that day. Another man had to make his way in and do it before the mine could be cleared for the next shift. Rumour is, the man who finished the fireboss run took a gun with him. It's a federal crime to take a gun underground, but if whatever it was had scared Big Jake, I can hardly fault the man. I had honestly never planned to write them at all, really. Most of the people involved never even talked about the unexplained things they had seen or heard in that place, or were very reluctant to. Perhaps it has to do with the trust coal miners have with one another. While I was in, I know the possibility that a methane build-up and explosion is a very real thing. It's happened numerous times in the past. Yet, I trust the fire bosses have done their runs correctly to monitor the gas. I trust the rock dusting crew is suppressing explosive coal dust. I trust the man running the multiple ton piece of equipment I have to work in close proximity with doesn't inadvertently crush me between a rock and a hard place. I trust my own skills when operating a roof bolter. If a man you're trusting your life with in a very dangerous location begins telling stories of shadow people walking around, phantom miners, disembodied lights, and a white humanoid figure I was informed was likely a crawler, how do you process that? How do you deal if you are someone seeing and experiencing them? Hey John, yeah, I got all the hay put up. Tractor gave me some trouble though. I did see a few good books around that I will be watching for this season. By the way, I saw a shadow person skulking around the feeder and beltline in 18 West. Might want to keep an eye out if it wants to drag you to hell, or follow you home to your family. Want to help load up the scoop? No worries, I won't accidentally crush the light out of you, trust me. This encounter is, by far, the one that was witnessed by the most people at once. The people who were involved consisted of mostly bosses, and men higher up in the pecking order of the mine. The encounter occurred during a visit by bosses and coordinators of the mine, just before the start of a major operation called a longwall move. It involves dismantling $100 million in equipment from a completed longwall section, transporting the equipment to a fresh longwall panel a couple years in the making, and putting it all back together. This is no small feat. This operation is an all hands on deck, highly coordinated, very labour intensive operation, with gobs of heavy equipment and people in motion. Coordinators and longwall bosses have been known to sleep, eat, essentially live at the portal until it's finished. To the encounter. It was Sunday afternoon. Countdown to kick off the midnight shift that was actually Monday morning. To the non-mining folks out there, a coal mine on a Sunday afternoon is essentially empty. Fire bosses do their runs, some contractors may be doing some out-by work, but generally speaking, mining sections are empty of miners. A man trip loaded with bosses and coordinators travel about 45 minutes on rail from the elevator bottom to the longwall panel, about to be loaded with millions in equipment used in the extraction of countless tons of that black rock. Upon arrival at that section, the men take their gear to what will soon be the dinner hall to put down their lunch buckets, coats, tools, gear, etc. After putting down their gear, they begin to move about the section talking shop concerning equipment locations, timetables, equipment operators to use, normal pre-operation talk. One of the bosses sees a figure walk from a crosscut. He points out the figure to the present party. The figure strolls out of the crosscut wearing a dim headlamp across what will be an equipment location, and into the longwall face, disappearing into the rock wall. The men are dumbfounded. They essentially run to the location, simultaneously calling dispatch on the radio, inquiring who else was up there, and the tracking information on all the parties present. Tracking station reports they're the only people there, and no dispatcher has sent anyone into section in many hours. The present crew scoured the section, looking for the figure most of them saw. After looking around, one of the bosses radioed the others to return to the dinner hall. All of the contents of their lunch pails, tools, jackets were upended and thrown about the location. It was like a 10-year-old on a temper tantrum was allowed to unleash his fury. The men, probably unnerved as they were, cleaned up and continued the task at hand. The longwall move started on time and completed pretty close to on schedule. The few that would talk about it afterwards were definitely shaken. Their radio chatter from that night were of scared men trying to stay calm and do their job. And they did. Yesterday, I froze my ass off. Fortunately, I'm not in Texas, and those areas struggling with no water, power, and thousands of dollars of electric bills, which I struggled to wrap my head around. My home was without power for around 7 hours yesterday. And with the piles of snow hanging around here in West Virginia, the temperature in my home was far more comfortable. While hanging out and reading my book, my mind began to wander back to some of those strange experiences I had while working in the mine. I think the cold helped to bring back the memory because that shift, among many others, was frigid. A common misconception people have is that the mine remains a constant temperature. This isn't true. Admittedly, during the summer months, the mine is somewhat cooler, as we're underground and not subjected to the direct solar radiation that serves to make the days so hot. This doesn't mean that men are comfortable during the summer months. The thing most people fail to realize is that coal mines are pumped full of air year round. Air measured in several thousand cubic feet per minute is required, by law, to course through that mine to provide ventilation. That means during the hottest summer months, hot and humid air is being forced underground into the workspace. The humidity gets so bad sometimes, condensation drips from everything. Add hot equipment, and I've literally witnessed men wring sweat from shirts. Conversely, this airflow tends to make the mine a very cold and bleak place during the winter months. Men working day shift arrive to the mine and cage down when the sun is mostly still below the horizon. They then work their shift in complete darkness and cage up when the sun is mostly set. The result is a man on day shift not getting to see the sun for a week or more. A man on midnight shift spends his work during the coldest hours of the day, pummeled by frigid air. When a miner doing heavy work sweats on any shift, that frigid air chills to the bone. Imagine your clothes being wet in December, then riding in the bed of a truck. I don't recall what shift I was working during this encounter. I do recall that my area was experiencing what was called a polar vortex. It didn't matter how many layers you wore, it was just so cold. I was working with a guy I'd been paired up with several times in the past. We had the same job bid, so it wasn't unusual for us to work together since we had the same job classification. We were working for a bit, then ducking into an area out of the direct airflow to try and stay warm. Several times while we were working together, I observed him stopping what he was doing and looking up the mine entry. I ignored this for some time as my only concerns at that moment were something like, holy shit cold, holy shit cold, holy shit cold, fuck me it's cold. Eventually, I had enough of him staring off up the entry and asked what the hell was the problem. He said, "Have you noticed the light?" I replied that I hadn't. We stepped out of the direct airflow and he told me that for the last hour or so, he'd seen a dim light moving back and forth up the entry. This was before my encounters with that, whatever it was, later in my career. I told him that it was likely our own cap lights he was seeing, and no one else was up there. We had to take a man trip and then walk quite a while just to get to our work area, and were far enough in that working alone was greatly discouraged. He then looked at me and said something that greatly disarmed me. He said, "I'm sure." We made a couple of seats on the mine floor, sat down and shut off our cap lights. For a minute or so, my brain tried to fill in the blackness and sensory deprivation from the complete lack of sight. Following that, my brain seemed to be okay, that I was sitting in the pitch black. We sat this way for probably 10 to 20 minutes. Time was hard to judge then. We sat completely silent when I began to see a dim light from a crosscut up the entry. The light got brighter until I could see a single point of dim light about the height of a man bobbing slowly along like the gait of a person walking casually. It crossed the entry and disappeared into the crosscut on the other side. I never saw anything but the dim light bobbing along, as if someone was slowly strolling about. At first, I wondered if it was my mind just filling in the sensory deprivation. However, at the moment the light broke the crosscuts and into the entryway, I heard my co-worker's intake of breath as he was processing what he was seeing. The light nearly faded from view as it entered the opposite crosscut, but stayed a dim glow. The light began to go brighter again as it emerged in the entry, to cross back to where it started. The light was a little dimmer on the return trip, but there's no mistaking it was there. We sat this way for another 30 or so minutes. Again, time was very hard to judge. The light seemed to mill around on the left side of the entry in the crosscuts out of the direct line of sight, until the area returned to pitch dark again. I struggled to estimate the amount of time light could be observed. After we got enough courage to speak to one another, we compared stories to be sure we observed the same thing. After our shift ended, 2 guys on the next shift were to travel up to where we were to continue roof bolting. If it wasn't done, to the next shift until completion. The job was completed before we had to return to the area the next day. So I think I'm going insane, but I don't know. I watched The Conjuring 3 2 nights ago, and the little odd happenings around my apartment have gotten worse. Last night, I was reaching for a pen on top of my mini fridge and it fell onto the floor. I got up and didn't see it and looked all around. I even looked under it and cleared the top of it because I literally touched it with my hand, so it had to have been there, right? It freaked me out and stressed me out, so I walked out of the living room and came back in and saw it on my desk. I was literally in shock. My boyfriend knew I was looking for it and said I probably put it there and forgot. It's definitely possible, but I doubt it. It was a very distinct houndstooth pen. It was like someone was just playing a joke on me. Today, when my boyfriend left the room and went to the bathroom, my TV just randomly turned off, but the sound kept playing. My boyfriend told me to chill, nothing is there. Before these incidents, there were weird things that happened on occasion that would be brushed off by me. One time, this foul sulfur odor filled the apartment, and we literally ran to the one corner of the apartment that the smell didn't hit. It was so weird, but by the front door, the smell wasn't as strong. My boyfriend thought it was a demon, and I thought it was a gas leak. I called emergency maintenance to check our hot water heater, and everything was fine. Right after the smell cleared out, my boyfriend and I heard a noise that sounded like an animal breathing or growling. Our neighbours upstairs have dogs, but they make very distinct noises, and this was not a domesticated pet. We both heard it, and we couldn't explain it. Also, while getting ready in the bathroom, I always see something in the mirror moving. If I looked into the mirror in my bathroom with the door open and looked into the living room, I could see something move, and it wasn't me or my boyfriend. I just feel like I'm being watched and played around with. I just need opinions, please. I feel like I'm going crazy. I can usually explain everything away, but these weird things and the extreme coldness is scaring the shit out of me. And it takes a lot to scare me.